Okay, so I think we're up and running. So it is September 2nd. Still a couple weeks away from you guys coming to class. Once again, Mr. Silva, Bill Silva, AP Bio teacher here at East Bridgewater Junior Senior High School. So I'm going to do a series of these video lectures. I'm going to use PowerPoint, or in this case, Google Slides, to kind of get the information out to you. So try to do a chapter at a time. We're going to cover 2 chapters today. So I want to review some of some of these things should be concepts or topics you've seen in the past, but we're going to zip through them and we'll kind of focus on some of the ones that are most important. In addition to the video lectures like this, I'm actually going to have some lectures that will involve use of the iPad as well too, but we'll see those later on as the school year progresses. Okay, a little slow today, the internet. All right, so once again, I'm not going to hit each one of these things, but so these are some of the themes that unify biology. So one of the things that in these themes in biology, AP biology, they're going to be broken down into 4 big themes. Themes include things like evolution, heredity, energy use, and things like how structure and function are combined. So we'll look at these 4 big themes as we go. Okay. A couple of the ones, there are some clickable pieces here. So if I click on this, it's going to, whoops, of course it's not going to bring me to that site, but that's okay. Let's go see if I get back to my presentation. Okay. So some of these are hyperlinks. Obviously, some of them aren't working right now. Probably they're older ones. But some of these you should be familiar with. For example, DNA. You should understand what DNA is. Kind of have the basics of how it works. Evolution, a topic that will come up over and over again throughout the course of the year. You'll find that that's a theme that that really runs through everything. For example, I'm going to look at this rabbit here, for example. So, one question you could ask is, why the heck are their ears so big? The head looks like a regular rabbit, body looks very similar, but man, I live in eastern Massachusetts. I've never seen a rabbit with ears that big. Is it a mutation? Is it a variation in the population? The answer is no. This particular rabbit happens to live out in the western part of the country where it's really warm. They use their ears as a way to get rid of heat. If you have a dog at home, dogs don't have sweat glands like we have. They don't have pores under their armpits and their groin and so on and so forth. They sweat through panting, so they hang their tongue out. Well, these guys have evolved to grow larger ears with large blood vessels that run through there, and this is the way that they dissipate heat. So it's pretty neat how some organisms have evolved over the course of time to be able to do certain things. The other thing we'll talk about is structure and level of structures. So, we won't spend a lot of time on the last 3, but the majority of what we'll look at will be from atoms to cells. We'll talk about tissues a little bit, but we'll talk about how atoms make larger molecules, which then make organelles, which then make cells, and so on and so forth. The first couple weeks of the school year will be mostly this kind of stuff here. So we're actually looking at chemistry of life, which is the first unit of instruction that we'll talk about. But one structure builds upon the next is the most important thing. Think of this as like a car. The car has systems inside, like an engine and transmission, a radio, a heating system, a cooling system, a system for safety like airbags, things like that. We can talk about, if we were talking about like a safety system in your car, we could talk about the fact that there's an airbag, right? And we can talk about that the airbag has multiple parts in it. Some of the parts are metal, some of the parts are plastic. All right, we can go even further and talk about like what type of plastic is the airbag material made out of. We could go look on a microscopic level and look at the type of molecules that they're made of. So we can break almost anything down with this type of a system. The other thing we'll look at how organisms work together in groups, whether it's through the whole biosphere, which is the entire planet, or we'll look at individual populations, so populations of like rabbits like we saw earlier. We might look at communities where it might be the rabbits and the wolves and humans and grass and hawks and how they all work together. So these will be some of those things that will come up through, once again, through the course of the year. We'll talk about how cells are the basic units of structure. So In your time taking life science classes, you've probably used microscopes. We won't really get into that much this year for a couple of reasons. One, it doesn't really fall within the frameworks, and two, believe it or not, due to COVID, it's one of the things that we have to push off to the side. We can't have people using microscopes because of the contact piece of it. Anyway, so we'll talk about cells being the basic unit of structure. We'll talk about something called the cell theory, of that all cells come from other cells, and the cells are the smallest living items that can be out there, which are basically these next two here. We'll also talk about cells come in different types. So the two major types of cells are prokaryotes and eukaryotes. The term or piece of this word, karyotic, has to do with the nucleus. So prokaryotes, pro is before, you protest before something happens. So prokaryotes are before a nucleus, and EU means true in Latin. These are cells with a true nucleus inside. Because there are cells that have something that looks like a nucleus, but it's really not, so that's why we separate that into a prokaryote. So prokaryotic cells are things like bacteria, no nucleus, whereas all other cell types like animal cell, plant cell, fungus cells, all actually have internal membranes and nuclei. Once again, some basic, these would be some things that you should know coming in, but it's always something we can work with as we go. So prokaryotic cells, these are cells that are relatively old. They do have DNA. They have a different shape of DNA. When we talk about prokaryotes, their DNA is going to be circular as opposed to linear. So imagine that they have like a DNA that's in a loop in prokaryotic cells, where cells with a nucleus have DNA that you can grab both ends of the DNA and stretch it out to make a long, thin line. Okay, just to give you an example, a typical prokaryotic cell, like a bacteria, might have anywhere from 50 to 200 genes, where in their entire genetic makeup in one cell. Whereas in humans, we might have anywhere from, I think the number somewhere around 37 to 40,000 genes in the typical human eukaryotic cell. So our cells tend to be bigger. They have a storage place for those genes in the form of DNA, and those strips of DNA, or those long linear pieces of DNA in humans, are kept inside of a nucleus, just like other eukaryotic cells. Let's see how I apologize for the lag here. Must be the internet a little bit today. Just click once, I guess. Okay. We'll talk a little bit about DNA and how DNA makes life continuous. So, for example, you are a continuation of your parents, just like I'm a continuation of my parents, meaning that there are some genes, some physical traits that you see on me that both my parents had. They both were short. My mom had light-colored hair. My mom had brown eyes. I have my father's body shape and body structure. Okay, so all of these things are continuity that were given to me from the people that came before me. I'll have to show you this great picture from it was a wedding from like the 1920s. It was three guys in the picture. All three had suits on, like big three-piece suits and stuff like that. And the running joke is which one is my relative, and obviously it happens to be the shortest one of the group, but it was actually my grandfather's father. So it's interesting to see that how this, once again, this continuity goes from generation to generation to generation. We'll talk about how DNA is copied. We'll talk about how it's encoded. We'll talk about how DNA makes RNA, which makes proteins, which is this thing called the central dogma of biology. But once again, this is all intro stuff. So just as you're reading through, if there are things that you struggle with or things that, hey, I'm not really sure what he's talking about there, if I have more questions, we'll get to this. Here comes the awkward silence lag here with the internet. You can hear me clicking away. Okay. So then we'll talk about structure and function. So we'll talk about the fact that shapes of things dictate how they work. And it's true with something as simple as, well, not as simple, but as complex as the wing on a plane. The wing on a plane has a specific shape. It's really wide in the front, narrow in the back. And it has this bubble that kind of goes on the very top of if you look at the wing from the side, it's bubbled on top. And it's kind of flat on the bottom. And the idea behind that is it changes the speed of the air as it runs over the top of the wing and under the wing. The air over the top goes faster, The air under the bottom goes slower. Because of that, the air on the top is lighter, and you create lift. Right? So something as simple as that structure dictates how it's going to work. The same thing is true in biological systems. Most of our technology that we use today, most of our structure, function, what something looks like, and how it works, comes from what we see in nature. A real neat one, if you ever get a chance to talk to your math teacher about this, something called fractals. Fractals are a form and function type of thing that you'll see in nature. Don't have the experience really to get into it, but be a great question for your math teacher. Okay, so that kind of wraps up chapter 1 for the most part. Read through it. I'm not going to have you, you won't be tested on it or anything like that, but it does kind of set the stage for some of the things that are going to come forward. So the next piece of information that's going to be helpful for you, and sorry, I keep looking at the time. I'm meeting at 1:30, so we'll try to get this done before then. So chemical context of life. So this is chapter 2. So these are terms you should know. Most of you are coming out of chemistry from last year. You should know what matter, elements, compounds, atoms, atomic number, atomic mass, isotopes, energy, or energy levels, or orbits. You should know some of these things. Don't worry if you can't remember them. We're going to pop back in. If you look at this simple diagram to the right, it's a diagram of an atom. And we've got 3 major parts, these little blue things on the outside, which are running around in these rings. Those are the electrons. Now, ironically, how they have the rings are kind of off in some respects, but that's okay. Protons have these little red pluses, so positively charged. Electrons have to be negatively charged, and you get these gray neutral-looking things. Those are the neutrons. Notice the neutrons are sandwiched between the protons. That's done by design in nature, in the sense that 2 positive things will want to push each other apart. If you didn't have these neutrons in between them, the protons will want to push apart or push away from each other or repel each other, which would then cause issues. Same thing, these negative electrons, as one moves closer to another, they repel each other, and that's where you get this movement around the outside of the outside of the atom, which is super cool. So one of the things, once again, this is for you kind of at home to watch. Obviously, we'll cover a little bit more of this in class as we go. So we'll talk about the fundamentals of chemistry, in the sense we'll use the periodic table of elements to determine like what shape elements are, how those elements are related to one another. We'll talk about some in particular. There are about 25 total that make up the biological world. About 5 or 6 of them are super important. 4 in particular: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. You'll have to know really well. In addition to some other ones like sodium, potassium, chloride, magnesium, things like that, which we'll get into. So once again, top, bottom is how we split this up. The very top, C-O-H-N, or CHON, if you want to say it that way, or NOC, N-O-C-H, whatever works for you. I like to list them as hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon is how I would list them, but you'll see why in class. Has to do with the number of bonds it can make. So in this case, when we draw them, when you look at their atomic structure, you'll find that hydrogen makes 1 bond, oxygen makes 2, nitrogen makes 3, and carbon makes 4, which really explains how they work and what they do in biological systems. The other elements that are found in a small portion, but just as important as the other ones, are things like sodium, potassium, phosphorus, chlorine, magnesium, calcium. A lot of these that you're seeing here, I'll use sodium, chlorine, magnesium, calcium, phosphorus, sulfur, not so much, but they're all ions, right? They're all either positive or negative ions. They're electrolytes, all right? If you think about cramps, right? One of the reasons you get cramps is because you're lacking potassium. You have this thing in your body called the sodium-potassium pump, and it's an ion exchange pump. And the idea behind it is it moves ions across a membrane to generate electrical impulses to allow your muscles to contract and for you to send nerve signals. If you are lacking potassium, right, you almost always have plenty of sodium because of the food that we eat. But if you're lacking potassium, one of the issues you can have is you can cramp. And it causes this sodium-potassium pump to stop functioning because of the lack of potassium, which would be a muscle cramp. And once again, we'll get into more of that as we go. So normally here what we would do in class, I would draw some pictures for you. We'll actually do this using the iPad, and I'll make a video for that as well. Also, we'll do some in class. So these are the types of chemical bonds that you'd be responsible for knowing and understanding. So covalent, double covalent, nonpolar covalent, polar covalent, ionic, hydrogen, and van der Waals. realistically, the top four, they have all the same one word in there that shows up, covalent. Covalent bonds share electrons. So in those types of bonds, you're going to see sharing of electrons. As we go down a little further, ionic bonds create ions, plus and minus ions. Those ions will then be used to actually create bonds. So think of them as like magnets, a positive and negative magnet kind of sticking together. Hydrogen bonds deal with hydrogens or include hydrogens, which we'll get into, and van der Waals are interactions within molecules. So covalent bonds, here's a couple examples. You have hydrogen, H2, diatomic, oxygen, O2, diatomic, meaning that there are two of the same elements stuck to each other. We have water, which is one of the most important elements we'll talk about, and then methane gas. This is the stuff that cows emit, stuff that's in farts. It's a flammable gas. So in each one of these settings here, you're seeing that electrons are being shared. So there are these things called valence electrons. Valence electrons are the electrons on the outside of a molecule. We'll draw this in class at some point. So each hydrogen has one electron, which they bring to the party here, and they share that in between. The reason they share them is each hydrogen wants to have a full outside valence shell. In the case of hydrogen, which is in the first row of the periodic table, it wants 2 electrons in that shell. If we go back down to water here, for example, we see that water has oxygen and 2 hydrogens. Notice that they draw this line between the H's. That line shows you that's a covalent bond or 2 electrons being shared. Oxygen has 2 of those lines. So there's 2 covalent bonds, one between a hydrogen and oxygen, one between oxygen and hydrogen. Once again, hydrogen makes 1 bond, oxygen makes 2 bonds, carbon makes 4 bonds, 1, 2, 3, 4. You'll see why as we go. Oxygen has 8 electrons that it brings to the table or to the party. 2 in the first ring, 6 in the second ring. It needs 2 additional electrons. That's where these extra electrons come from. They come from hydrogen, and they share those electrons. And once again, we'll draw it out. It'll make a little bit more sense. Same thing's happening here with methane. Carbon has 4 valence electrons, 2 in this first ring, 4 in the second ring, and it's looking for 4 more electrons. Hence why it can bond with 4 hydrogens. We're talking about single, double, triple covalent bonds. I have this great little activity we do in class where actually I probably can't do it this year because it's social distancing, but normally I would have 2 people hold hands, and these people, as they hold hands, one arm out extended and they're holding hands. That would show 1 bond. Have 2 people holding hands, holding their arms out like this would be 2 bonds, and then 2 people and then touching their feet would be a third bond. So it's either 1, 2, or 3 bonds between elements. Polar and nonpolar covalent. I'm going to zip through this really quickly. Obviously, definitions here. Electronegativity. So, here's how I want you to think about this. When we talk about atoms, we'll talk about fat guys and skinny guys. Oxygen is a big fat guy. Why are they a fat guy? It's larger than hydrogen is one reason. Another reason why is oxygen has 8 protons. All right, hydrogen has 1 proton. Protons are positively charged. They draw electrons. So oxygen is more electronegative, has more draw on electrons than hydrogen does because it has 8 protons compared to 1. So these guys, I'm going to go back to 1, they're going to share their electrons just like this. So they're going to share a pair of electrons. What happens, though, is these electrons, because oxygen is stronger or a big fat guy, there's a tug-of-war going on. And hydrogen loses the tug-of-war. Doesn't lose it completely, but loses the tug-of-war in the sense that the electron in hydrogen is pulled closer to oxygen. It's not equally shared. Because of that, on one end of the molecule, in this case water, you get a slight, this little thing he means slightly, negative, that little symbol there, slightly negative and slightly positive. So there are 2 slightly negatives and 2 slightly positive charges formed on water, which makes it polar. Anything that's slightly charged or charged is polar. Ionic bonding. So I'm going to go back to that thing we just talked about here. Remember I said oxygen was a fat guy? Oxygen was a fat guy, and hydrogen's a skinny guy. In this case, the fat guy wins the electron but doesn't take it away completely. Hydrogen still has a little bit of a hold on it. In ionic bonds, it's a little different. Here's what happens. We have 2 sets of elements. We have sodium, we have chlorine. They want to have a full, when I say they, the atoms want to have a full outside shell. Okay, that's what they'd strive to be. Not too many, not too few, just the right number, which is a full shell. Notice that the sodium has one extra one on the outside. Chlorine has 7 on the outside. It's missing one spot. What happens is here, chlorine being more electronegative pulls the electron towards itself because it's got more protons than sodium does. 17 and 11 are the number differences. So because there are more protons, that electron gets pulled away. Now the reason this electron gets pulled away and not shared is look at how far, right? If there's 1, 2 rings in between the positive components and the negative components. So because this is further away from the positive inside shell, it's easier, it's got less of a hold on it, it's easier to give it away. So that electron then lands here. You get chlorine with now an extra electron. Sodium loses an electron. Sodium becomes +1 because it lost in one negative thing. Chlorine becomes -1 because it gained one negative thing. And you get these two separate molecules that are held together by a plus-minus charge, very similar to magnets. That's ionic bonding. All right, I think we're going to stop at that one there. The rest of the bonding ones we'll talk about in class. I hope this was a good start for you. If you have any questions, I take that back. I'm going to show you one more, I think. I'm going to show you this hydrogen bond before we get there. I apologize, I'm going to bounce around like this a little bit. So the hydrogen bonds, we talked about earlier. Let me go back. Here was our water molecule, right? Notice there's 1, 2 slightly negatives and 1, 2 slightly positives. In hydrogen bonding, here's the hydrogens. Hydrogens, where they're so small and they lose the ability to hold their electron close, they create that slightly positive charge. That slightly positive charge of the hydrogen attracts the negative charge of the water molecule. The oxygen atom in the next water molecule. So if you've ever spilled water on the table, it kind of pools up and kind of makes like a little a puddle, if you will, but it kind of stays together. And if you took like a piece of paper towel and put that paper towel next to the puddle, it draws the puddle, and the water kind of like the water front and the puddle kind of follows along. It's because of these hydrogen bonds. Super, super weak bonds. How do we break them? Heat them up. All right, if you've ever made mac and cheese, put the water in the pan, put the pan on the stove, lid on the pan, the lid on the underneath is nice and dry, turn the heat on. As the water starts moving around, you start breaking hydrogen bonds, and the water molecules literally jump out of the pan, and they evaporate, and they land on the bottom of the lid, getting condensation. So heat is a way to break these kind of bonds. All right, this is where I'm going to stop here. I will post this online, and we're going to go from there.